Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Truth be told, we didn't expect so much people to come. We received more than 200 registration, but you never know how many people actually come. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for showing interests. Thank you. We welcome you to our panel discussion, China, an example to follow. It has been organized by Efficient Governance Initiative, our student association. We are pretty new. We founded our organization just last July. And yeah, if you want to find out more about us, you can just scan this QR code and find everything on our user-friendly website. But let's not waste any time and proceed. We are very grateful to our sponsors for letting this event happen. Thank you very much, and we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail later. We're also very grateful to our patron, as we organize this event in cooperation with Asia Oriental Institute of UCTH. Without them, it would have been absolutely impossible to secure this room, to get all the equipment for free. We are very grateful for their support. And now let's start. Let's briefly go through our plan for today. First of all, I'm going to introduce how we even came to this topic, why we decided to discuss China. Afterwards, we proceed to introduction of our esteemed speakers, then panel discussion that will evolve into interactive Q&A session, then some little time for quick announcements, and afterwards, apéro for everybody. So let's not waste any time. Let's stay efficient and discuss why we even decided to tell about this topic to our students, to UCTH and ETH students. Well, as many of you happen to know, China is evolving rapidly. And over the course of past few decades, they made quite a progress. Namely, it's now the second largest economy in the world, producing almost 18% of global GDP. And since 2000, China's GDP has grown more than 16-fold, lifting over 800 million of people out of poverty. It also has been the world's largest exporter since 2009. And speaking of university, not only about business, right now they do have 13 universities in top 100 universities worldwide, while 20 years ago they had only 2 in this list. Speaking of infrastructure, we all have heard about Chinese infrastructure and how they quickly develop it. Well, China has built over 40,000 kilometers of high-speed railroad. That accounts for about 2/3 of the world's total. Speaking of some building advances, in 1990 they had only 50 skyscrapers for the whole big country. Now they have more than 3,000. Technologically, we all have heard about latest advances of Chinese technology, namely about DeepSeek, new artificial intelligence. They're also pretty advanced in the use of robotics, as they implemented just in last year roughly 300,000 industrial robots. That accounts for over half of global implementation of robots into industry. They're not only successful inside their country, but also outside. I'm sure that everybody of you have heard about Belt and Road Initiative. And indeed, it's one of the ever existed largest investment efforts in history. They do operate in roughly 150 countries worldwide, on all continents, and they invested since 2013 more than $1 trillion in infrastructure in foreign countries, before all in developing countries, in Asia and in Africa. And all of this under certain and quite unique governmental model. One-party rule, emphasizing long-term planning, technocratic management, and rapid implementation. And after seeing all of these statistics, we thought, is it really as plain as it might seem from a first look? Do they really as successful as we might think about it, or are there any nuances? And to answer this question, we decided to organize this panel discussion and invited our esteemed speakers, professionals in that field, professionals and specialists in China, to discuss whether it's true, whether they're efficient, and if yes, what can we, as Europe, as Switzerland, as Western world in particular, can learn from them, if anything. So, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. And to begin with, I would like to invite former Ambassador Bernardino Regazzoni. Please rise up. Bernardino Regazzoni served as an ambassador in various countries. Latest was in China from 2019 to 2022, but before that he spent decades working for Swiss government, also serving as ambassador in Italy, in France, in Sri Lanka, and he's going to deliver us this diplomatic and political view on the efficiency. Please, take a seat. Next on our list, we have very esteemed, very renewed professor, true sinologist specialist in China, Professor Ralph Weber from the University of Basel. We decided that here in just political side or purely academic side, it's not that interesting. That's why we decided to invite Nico Luxinger. Nico Luxinger, thank you very much for coming. Nico Luxinger is the executive director of Asia Society Switzerland, the biggest NGO about Asia in the whole Switzerland, and he can deliver us interesting insights from a ground level, right? From business, from society, from people. What do they think about China and how do they interact with them? Do they also see Chinese model as efficient as some politicians or probably scholars? And last, but definitely not least, Professor Jan Christopher Mittelstädt. Have studied both in Europe and China, afterwards taught in Oxford. He is also a very big and recognized professional in sinology. Just arrived a couple of weeks ago from Oxford and started his career at the University of Zurich. He's going to deliver his insights on Chinese governance models. He's also our patron for this panel discussion, and thank you very much, not just for coming here and speaking, but also for supporting our event. Thank you. And on that note, it's going to be moderated by me. My name is Arkip, and I'm president of this student organization, Efficient Governance Initiative, that is in charge of organizing this panel discussion. And now, not to waste any time longer, let's proceed to panel discussion.
I think.
Jetzt now again.
Okay, let's start. To begin with, let's start with some icebreaker. And could you tell our audience, how did you personally find your way into China? What sparked your interest, and how did your career become intertwined with this country? Professor Mittelstädt, we are eager to hear your insights. How you decided to start studying sinology?
Sure.
Just push it.
Hello?
Sorry. And also, before we start, I forgot to say, this panel discussion is recorded, so we are going to post it on our YouTube channel. No worries for you, it's just we are recorded, but we need to make this announcement so everybody is on the same page. Thank you. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, great. So it's recorded, so I cannot say anything wrong. We'll
Big
see about
Brother is
that.
watching you.
My interest in China, actually, started after high school. I went to Beijing in 2007 for 1 year to do language studies, just randomly. And 1 year turned into 2 years, turned into 7 years. spending 7 years in Beijing doing my undergraduate in international relations, not with a China focus, just a normal IR kind of focus. Not that interested in China per se, rather than international relations. And then afterwards, I came back to Europe. And since then, my fate has been intertwined, actually, with Chinese politics. I studied Chinese constitutionalism, etc. And then during my DPhil in the UK, I delved deeper into area studies, etc. I'm a political scientist by training. I'm not a sinologist, traditionally speaking, but I'm more interested, compared to sinology, classical sinology, I'm more interested in the comparative aspect of authoritarian politics with China as a case study. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. And now, Nico, can you please share your insights, how you found your way to Asia, to China?
Yeah, it didn't really. It found me, in a way. So as maybe has become clear from the introduction, like, I'm not a sinologist. In fact, my academic career started here at the University of Zurich, where I studied medieval history, which I can tell you is a total career booster. So definitely do that. And then through a series of very complicated steps that I'm not going to bore you with, I kind of landed at the HSID Switzerland 10 years ago, which at that point was still in the process of being founded. And the reason they hired me originally is simply because they needed somebody quickly, and I happened to have time because I'd just been let go from my previous job. So opportunity, sometimes just finds you. The Asia Society works. There's Asia in our name, but there's also Switzerland in our name. And I've always argued that sort of the reason I'm doing this work is, yes, I'm interested in Asia, and Asia is incredibly relevant to our world today, but really I'm doing this because I care about Switzerland. We need to understand Asia. China is a big part of Asia. It's not the only part, but we need more Asia competence. We need more China competence. And the reason I'm saying this is, again, not because if necessarily an incredibly strong personal connection to that part of the world, but because I care about the continued success and relevance of Switzerland. So I'm interested in looking at China and other parts of Asia to the extent that I feel what's happening there will have an impact on us, and I think today's topic is an excellent example of that.
Professor Weber?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much for having me first, right? And my exposure to China actually has a date. It was 1997, Geneva. I was an MA student, and I did an exchange year at the Graduate Institute, and there I visited a course by Professor Wang Lenjin on the history of China. It was basically 20th century history, and I ended up in the library reading everything that I could on a person called Li De, Otto Braun, who was really important during the Long March. Right, and that caught my entire fascination and industry. And so I thought maybe I should invest more time into China. And then I finished my degree in St. Gallen and decided to do a PhD, which was then on a contemporary figure, Du Wei-ming, a Harvard professor at the time, later at Beida. Right, and he was a so-called new Confucian. So I actually started with philosophy, I should say, and Chinese intellectual history. And then from there, gradually, I would think around 2005, 2006, I started being interested in the interrelation between philosophy and politics, and particularly how the party state makes use of philosophy and tradition. Right, and at that time, there was like Hu Jintao misquoting the Analects, right, or things like that. I thought, how can he not know, right? Then you read a little bit further in the text and say, oh, that's why he didn't mention that part, right? And so that caught really my attention. And that ended, I think, or it increased when I had an opportunity in Beijing to see Xi Jinping talking to us about Confucianism. It was just after he assumed office. And I noticed in that speech, although he was talking about Confucianism, he always used the sentence, Confucianism and other Chinese traditions. And it was really telling. I analyzed that speech afterwards and published about it. And the point was to say, just anything would do, as long as it is a tradition, right? And it's Chinese. And that emphasis was really palpable at that time. And from then on, I would say I focused more and more on the politics side of things and went more into the CCP, and then came to specialize on what I call its transgressive political activities abroad, which embrace propaganda, United Front work, but also other sorts of engagements. And that's where I am today. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and you are very welcome. We are very happy to host you on our panel discussion. It's a great honor to have all of you today. Thank you very much for coming to us, especially for those who came from other parts of Switzerland. For you, Professor Weber, who came specially for our panel discussion from Basel, and to you, Ambassador Regazzoni, who made his long way from Lugano to our panel discussion. And of course, thank you all very much. But now let's proceed to the personal story of Mr. Regazzoni. How have you found your way into diplomacy broadly and more narrowly to China?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I am not the theoretician. I am unfortunately not a professor, so my contact and my habit to China is much shorter than yours, Professor. 97, mine before 2017. I had no clue about China, but I am more as a diplomat, the kind of a practitioner of the craftsman. You know, you have to learn very fast, very practical issues from day one. And then, especially in a country like China, you definitely need what you say, if not philosophy, at least theory, or you get lost. You really get lost because you think that let's do in a very pragmatic way to learning by doing, and you do not understand where you are or what you are doing. I think that the good news for professors and theoreticians, we increasingly need theory to understand the world and especially China. Since then, I arrived in 2019 to Beijing. And fortunately enough, after the end of my term, I had the opportunity to go again and again to China, because simply, in the first place, because it's a very passionate place. It's an endless object of research, and therefore it makes that interesting.
Thank you very much. So if you do study sinology, you're on the right way. But proceeding with the topic of our today's discussion, may I describe China as efficient in decision-making, especially in crisis, during the time of crisis? But what does efficiency mean personally for you? Is it speed, responsiveness, legitimacy, or whatever? Let's start our discussion. What do you think about efficiency? How should we define it?
I can say something on efficiency. I think that the term, right, it gives a lot. So you have a goal and you have means, right? And if you can use as little means as possible to reach as big a goal as possible, then you're probably being efficient. But that also means the entire discussion about efficiency is goal dependent. It depends what your goal is. I might not share that goal. So that, I think, is important for the discussion of China. And I understand from how the event was set up, it basically means the regime, right? It doesn't mean Chinese people. It doesn't mean culture, right? It's about efficiency and bureaucracy was in there, so it's the regime. And we should always be careful not to mix those things together too much, right? But so in this discussion, I think for me it will be important to understand whether we are taking up the perspective of that of the Communist Party, for instance, that has to govern the country. Is it being efficient, right? That we might want to discuss, but that's a different discussion, whether that is something I would agree with, right? Or whether I share the goal. And that, I think, is important because one could easily discuss whether it is right to just talk about efficiency without talking about the different goals. And that's where I would stand on the efficiency. So it is from the words that you proposed, right? Responsiveness, legitimacy, and adaptability, and speed. I do understand these are different modes, maybe, with efficiency, but I would rather prefer to stick with the term itself and discuss the goal and the means. Right?
Thank you very much. And what do other panelists think about it? Do you share this idea? So you would oppose? So the first two.
From my more, as I introduce a practical and point of view, I entirely agree. It's a very tricky definition, efficiency. What does it mean? Is that the same as effectiveness? Definitely thinking about China, there is an image of speed linked to that. You know, you see Pudong, skyscrapers, you see Shenzhen, 40 years to build the 18 million city, fourth most important harbor in the world. Is that efficiency? And if yes, why? It is something which has to do with rule of law. So if somebody decided simply to go, he has not to respond to anybody. So just go. If the decision is correct, you are going to go very fast. But allow me not to agree at all, just to nourish the discussion with the point about crisis. I had the dubious luck to live along with somebody here in the audience who was in my staff in Beijing, the COVID crisis in Beijing. To make it short, the first part you can discuss if it was more or not a success, but definitely the second part, when Switzerland was going out and the rest of the world was going out of the crisis. Some of you might remember the Omicron, we forget that luckily. Omicron virus, it has been a total disaster because the decision was wrong. No self-corrective mechanism because you go the same way as before. You paralyze the whole country, the value chains towards outside. You spend a number, $200 billion US. That's an official and a semi-official. That was Bloomberg from Bank Nomura, the Japanese bank, who estimated how much it has been spent by the Chinese government in testing people in the second part of COVID. Sorry, that's not efficiency. That's inefficiency. And the reason I think that this particular system has weaknesses in self-correcting mechanism. And I think it is one of the reasons why Switzerland has been not so bad off. Because, you go the wrong way, then you can correct a bit, then you correct once again, and so on. There would be more to say, but I don't want to maybe later about is efficiency allocation of resources, doing more with less. This is also efficiency. And I think China might be a good example. DeepSeek is efficient. I mean, with far less resources than ChatGPT, the result is maybe the same, more a decentralized approach to in artificial intelligence. So there are different possible meanings of efficiency, speed, allocation of resources, flexibility. I think that the weakest, speaking about China, but I think there is space for discussing more in depth.
Well, do you have something to say about it? Nico, you're looking at me, very intriguing.
I always have something to say. It's a prerequisite of my job, really. So not to repeat any of the points that were made before about which I agree. If you're not a trained sinologist like the professors here on stage, you kind of have to think about a country as complex and diverse and enormous as China, sort of in shorthands. And one of the shorthands that I've come to like, it's not a line from me, but different people say this in different points, is that Chinese policy tends to be effective but not efficient. And I really like this distinction. So Chinese policy actually does, again, not always, but broadly, very often, you see Chinese policy achieving the goal that is set out, and we can discuss whether we agree with the goal, probably, usually not. But it does, sort of set out to achieve the goal. Definitely not with the fewest possible resources invested, right? In many ways, sort of the way the Chinese government achieves its results could be considered quite wasteful. That did not necessarily hinder, the broad success of the country and its economy, as outlined in the introduction, and we can talk about why that is, and whether that will continue to be true, right? So I think there is some indication that the effective but not efficient model might sort of reach a little bit its upper bound. I'm glad Ambassador Regazzoni brought up COVID, because I think it's the prime example of like a quick decision, a decision taken very quickly, but then like they stuck with it for way too long. And one of the most impressive graphs you'll ever see is if you look at Chinese consumer confidence plotted over time, and it kind of stays roughly in the same area, and then in April 2022 it crashes by 40 points, and it hasn't recovered since. Mm-hmm. And you know what happened in April 2022? It was the Shanghai lockdown. It was the time when it became clear that the policy that China has chosen, which long was much more successful, right? They were able to contain this virus much better than we were until that point, and that's when it reversed. And I think that's a sort of that's an instructive lesson, and I think they're in a way still paying the price for not adapting more quickly.
Thank you very much.
Jump in?
Yeah, of course. We are waiting for your inputs.
So I think there are, of course, many ways to define efficiency, etc. But I think one thing, and I agree with Professor Weber, is that we have to look at goals and who sets these goals. And of course, within the system of the People's Republic of China, it is the party state and the party in particular who sets goals. Okay. That's one of the fundamental characteristics of the system. But going further than that, we always make the mistake of attributing the Chinese Communist Party a kind of monolithic structure or monolithic figure, and this is not at all true. Right? So the leadership can decide something, and the local government, provincial government, they can have very different interests, right, which are embedded within their evaluation systems. How do you get promoted? What is good for your own jurisdiction, etc. So here you have a misalignment of incentives, a misalignment of goals between the center, Beijing, and the local level, which can lead in many different ways to situations such as COVID, where you had the leadership in Beijing saying something, this is what we want to do, but from a local perspective, this was not at all what is good for the local area. So that's a misalignment between the center and the local level. And then at the local level and at the center as well, you have misalignment in terms of what goals are actually to be pursued efficiently. Right? So what is good? Is it stability maintenance? Is it economic growth? Is it environmental protection, etc.? And more, very often these goals collide. And then, as a local official, what do you do? Right? What do you do? What is the best course? What is the best course of action? Right? And the best course of action usually is not the one that is determined by economic efficiency, or what is economically efficient, what produces less waste, what maximizes output, what saves time, what saves money, etc. Because the system is not governed by economic efficiency; it is governed by political efficiency, which is very much misaligned at all levels and in different sectors. So you get all kinds of messed up really results, such as COVID, which was not efficiently economically, but from a political perspective, it made sense until it didn't make sense, and then it kind of collapsed on itself. Just one quick word about the crisis kind of thing. If there's one thing the Chinese Communist Party is very good at, it is mobilizing people. Mobilizing people. It was very evident during the COVID pandemic, that they managed in a very short amount of time to mobilize a lot of people. They mobilized the economy, mobilized manufacturing. Yes. So here, this is an example where if you have a total or near total alignment of goals throughout the entire system and in terms of sectors, you can very quickly get things done. But most of the time, you don't have that. You literally never have that, except in crisis situations such as these exceptional COVID circumstances.
Thank you very much. Right now, I do see some contradiction. On one hand, they do make quick decisions, but also waste resources. They are not flexible, but sometimes they're efficient. How come? Where is the problem of China? What would you say? Is it bureaucracy? Is it sort of non-democratic, non-responsive political rule? So where does this ground for possible inefficiency lies, according to you? What would you say? Nico, would you like to start?
I'm not sure I feel totally qualified to answer this question. I'm just going to throw out a guess, and then the professors can sort of fact check me on this. I mean, there's plenty of reasons, and what I always found interesting, and I kind of want to go back to your introduction, because I think you told the China story that is very present, which is this story of kind of efficient infrastructure building. And I don't know if anybody in the room has read the book Abundance by Ezra Klein, which is a huge topic right now in the US, because it sort of talks about, sort of the American inability of building things, right? We've become so entrenched as a society that, if you want to go and by the way, you should talk about university, about how long it took to sort of tear down the building over there and build a new thing. They went totally crazy. And kind of we conscious this with China, where basically, sort of the idea is, well, the government can just decide we need, 10,000 kilometers of high-speed rail here, and then that just gets built. And I think there's a certain truth to this. And I do think that's a problem that we, as broadly European Western societies, have, that we should address. And perhaps there's something that we can learn in there. Although, of course, there's also one of the reasons China can build things faster is because of lack of due process and democratic accountability. There's other reasons I think that sort of are more pertinent. But I also think, and I've always found this very fascinating, is that more infrastructure isn't necessarily better, right? So there's probably an optimal amount of kilometers of high-speed rail that a country can have. I don't know what this is for China, but I'm pretty sure they've built more than it, right? So and again, you can look at the data to bear this out. There's ever and for years been decreasing marginal returns on investment. So I think the story here is also one of a country and of a government that likes to invest and that likes to drive economic growth by investment. And in many ways, I think sort of there's a reason to say that they're actually over-investing. Again, this this has actually worked in the past. I think it's questionable whether it's gonna work in the future. I think that would be one lever for sort of correcting. And if you see what the Chinese government is doing, they are desperately trying to get to increase how much people consume, because the problem, why can they invest so many things? Because the savings rate is too high. So there's actually just money that needs to go somewhere. So it goes into more high-speed rail kilometers, even though it probably would be more efficient if the money went somewhere else, if it went into sort of domestic consumption. And I think that's sort of one lever going forward that the Chinese sort of policymakers will have to try to adjust this and get rid of this policy of, I would argue, overinvestment.
Thank you for your insights, very interesting, but what have science to say about it? Professor Weber?
I don't know what science has to say about it, but I can tell you what I have to say on it. Right?
Scholars.
Science, unfortunately, doesn't speak, or at least not in one voice. Maybe we'll get there, right? But I think the question has some premises, and I do think, if you have a top-down system, that I would defend the Chinese political system is, right? In its own constitution, Article 3, it says democratic centralism, how you get to decisions, right? And so you've got the democratic in there, and you've got centralism in there. Both have a sort of significance in there, but I don't think that, of course, the democratic is not democratic in any way conceivable of the term, I would say, right? But there's something about that, and what it is consultation. And that is an element that I think you could find in many ways across the political system in the People's Republic at all the levels. Also, there is consultation. But consultation also just means that you have people say what they are allowed to say. Right? It can mean that you have them say and ignore it. It leaves you all the power with you, basically. But it's something that a good dictator would do, right? If you need to steer and you're 100 million people as a party, and I agree with the point about the sociology of the party, and it's not all one monolith, right? We would need probably more distinctions there. But still, you're in a minority, right? So you have to co-opt the sectors that you can in your own society. You have to do a little propaganda here and there, and all of those things, right? And then this minority can actually govern. And to do that, it's just very clever to have consultation in there. So you do that. So to be more effective in how to use your power and how to keep your power. And that's where I think this top-down approach comes in with consultation. So bottom-up, yes, information. You can show that in so many ways. Before a term is being used in the center, you've got good examples, how these terms are thrown out into the provinces. Right? Who declared Xi Jinping to be the core of the party? How did that work? It wasn't like the Xi Jinping saying, by the way, did you know I'm the core of the party? Right? He will not say that. I mean, stupid in his position. So you have you throw that out into the provinces, it goes around, the provinces respond or not, right? Some will, it gets amplified. Then you have some notions that come up that are almost like saying Xi Jinping is the core of the party. You invent some new ones, like you've got the consciousness, core of the consciousness and this and that, right? And eventually the party, after this has gone on for almost a few, like 2-3 years even, right? The party will come to declare Xi Jinping the core. Right? So this is how consultation works in practice, but you throw something out. So it's not, I think, this monolith dictator sort of mechanism that we would often think it is. There is a role for consultation, but still in the end, it's top-down, I would say.
So as far as I understood, you say that sort of this mixed top-down perspective of Chinese government is sort of double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's efficient, but also might lead to some troubles.
Yeah, it comes with a political agenda, right? That's part of the problem. It comes with a political agenda. I think many of you will know about the 2 centennial goals, right? So 2021, first goal achieved, right? And in 2049, we can already now know it will be achieved. Because there's just no way not to achieve it. Right? So why centennial, so 100 years, right? And so it's from the founding of the party in 1921, so in 2021 it had to be achieved. So not in 2020 or 2022, it was a big goal, elevation or abolishment of absolute poverty, right? A decently modest wealthy society, all of that was there. When was it achieved? Exactly 2021. I mean, that's a good landing, exact on the point, but it also shows how there was no way this would not be achieved, and that's the political logic of things, right? And that's where I think inefficiency comes in also, because there's no leeway of saying, oh, we didn't achieve that. Now, sometimes in the 5 years plan, you do have assessments of how this or that has been achieved, but not for the whole ideological framework. There's no choice, right? So you always have to be right. You can't be wrong at that level. And we see very little of that. And that is not very efficient, I would think, right? So if you try to raise your children that way, good luck, right? It doesn't work.
Okay, thank you very much. And Professor Mittelstädt, I know that you studied a lot about local governance structure in China and how do they interact with sort of core party. How do they control it? How do they define the ideas and how do they make sort of regions to implement it and to achieve these goals? How do they communicate with other parts of country?
How much time do you have?
Well,
that's a whole separate lecture. Policy implementation. But yeah, no.
There's some words, so we have overall impression of it.
No, of course. But before I talk about that, very quickly about bureaucracy in China. There's this really massive tension at the core of the Chinese Communist Party, which loathes, hates bureaucracy. Okay, it really hates bureaucracy, and it has hated bureaucracy since the Mao era. Okay, Mao hated bureaucracy, and there's even one current of thought that he launched the Cultural Revolution because he was upset with the bureaucracy, with the elite class that had been or had established itself and had taken control over the country, right? So that's why he then later said we need a cultural revolution every 10, 15 years to get rid of the new elites, to establish a country where the leadership, the policymakers, everyone is closer to the masses, is closer to the people. Now this obviously didn't happen, and Mao died famously in 1976. And what happened after, if he saw that, he would probably roll over in his grave because China obviously embraced capitalist values and values of economic efficiency. But this idea that China hates bureaucracy, that China hates formalism, right? The signing of forms that a lot of cadres have to spend a lot of time on, right? Has never gone away. And if you now look at the main function of the disciplinary mechanism in China that punishes officials at the center and at the local level, if you look at the numbers, then every month thousands of officials are punished because of bureaucratism, because of formalism. Right? They're punished because they are too bureaucratic. Okay, just think about it. Okay, there was also measures being brought in within the state, within the Chinese Communist Party, to get rid of bureaucracy, to get rid of these forms that people have to sign, that people have to justify, justify their decisions, their spending, and whatnot, right? But paradoxically, what this has led is to a proliferation of new kinds of documents that they have to sign now to say, okay, I'm following this new line of reducing bureaucracy. They have to sign 2 more forms now, and you get all these nice little photos on WeChat and whatnot, with massive tables in meeting rooms with all kinds of forms and documents that local cadres have to sign, where they have to spend hours every day and hours every week, really just not doing policy implementation or not doing, what they're supposed to be doing, which is their job, going outside and whatnot, rather than spending this time on really signing documents and making sure that they justify their own jobs kind of to their superiors. So the reduction of bureaucracy has led to an increase of bureaucracy. Okay, and this tension that, yes, you have here a goal that is very clear, where the top leadership is quite aligned, but they have not been able to achieve that. They have not been able to do that, because one reason is that it goes against the core incentive within the Chinese Communist Party, which is bureaucratization, which is the aspiration to, as the party admits itself in its party constitution, to lead everything. Yeah. If you want to lead everything, you need to establish control, you need to establish, you need to regulate everything, and to do that, well, what do you need? Well, you need more bureaucracy, you need more paperwork, right? So you want to reduce, but at the same time, you want to have control over as many things as possible. So how do you reconcile that? And the answer is you don't, or you can't. And we see evidence of that within the Chinese Communist Party. Now, this didn't answer your question. It didn't answer another question. It did answer another question, and I'm happy with that.
Thank you very much. But to have sort of a whole picture, I would like to elaborate on this more. Mr. Regazzoni, you have worked in various countries as ambassador. You've seen a lot of different sort of governmental structures. How do European countries, some other Asian countries function, and what could you say from this point of view? Does China less bureaucratic than other Asian countries, maybe some European countries such as Switzerland, France, or Italy, where you also served as ambassador? What would you say from your experience?
Yes, it's a very large question indeed. I would say every country has its own history, and therefore comparisons are quite difficult, even in the same continent. I served in 3 different Asian countries. I can tell you it's very few things in common from one to the other. China is Asia is particularly large. In Africa, it's the same. I served in 2 African countries, very different from each other. I mean, history plays a role which makes comparisons very difficult. But let's answer your question, which is an interesting one, and I can just bring how I felt dealing with Chinese authorities. Was that more complex than and can I compare with other Asian countries, for instance? I would say, seen from the outset, I would say it tends to be rather bureaucratic. You have to deal to understand what is the process, as in many other countries, even European countries. You have to understand how independent is the civil servant you have in front. I think that in comparison to Switzerland is very low, the degree of independence, let's say freedom or self-judgment. That's one aspect. The other one, and that's something important in every country, how what you're asking for, is that or not a priority for the government? And if yes, to whom you have to liaise? Or to understand early enough that that's not a priority at all, and so how to reformulate things. But that's not something specific to China. That's for every country where you're dealing. In China, what is specific, it takes more time to understand, even for a non-specialist like me, takes more time. The system is far more intransparent because before understanding who's in charge for the political decision, not just the formal thing where I have to put my paper. No, it's not. It's who's deciding that. It takes a lot of time. It's a lifetime achievement. I mean, to understand that. So in the practical experience, bureaucracy is quite high, or let's say the level of intransparency, for not in terms of governance, in terms of simply to understand how the system works.
Thank you very much. Now let's proceed to other questions. So from now on, what we have heard, they are at least not less bureaucratic than we. They are sometimes not as efficient. I remembered the line said by Nico that it's effective but not efficient. Yet it has problems. It's not self-correcting. It's not responsive to people. It's bureaucratic. Sometimes it wastes resources. But at the end of the day, how did they manage to achieve what they achieved? What is, in your opinion, the main driver of their success? Right? So if you remember at the beginning of our panel, I just listed a couple of the achievements, and they're impressive. What makes them to do so well? Professor Weber, would you like to start?
I think it's a combination of many factors, right? And some of them, I think, have more to do with China, the PRC. Some of them have more to do with an international environment and how the rest of the world had reacted to the so-called rise of China, has maybe also facilitated it. Right? And if you look at it in global terms, I do think that the entry of the People's Republic to the WTO was a game changer in many ways, right? And then you see how really the development kicks off in a different way. So that is and so in that sense, was that by the wisdom of the Communist Party? I'm not so sure, right? Will they say that it was by the wisdom of the Communist Party? You bet, sure, right? I would also say that, right? But I think that's, in a way, if you want to be cynical, right? And sometimes you heard that even that word going around, that all of that development was possible despite the Communist Party. That's one take on it. Now, if you look at it as a country, right, you have a lot of volume, right? You had and have a lot of people, a lot of resources, a lot of things that you would need for that were in place. Right? You do have an extremely industrious population and a lot of clever people. All of that is there, right? And they were also cultivated very much with that goal in view. So not to become critical, unhappy Socrates in society, which you might want to have for other goals that you can have as society, right? But to achieve that development and everything in such a setting can be, I think, oriented towards just achieving that goal, right? Were people made happier during that? Yes, of course, right? Did living become more comfortable? Yes, of course, right? Was that so for everyone? Of course not, right? So like any political system, whether democracy or authoritarian countries have winners and losers, right? In democracies, there's just a discussion about the losers, and sometimes we agree that there shouldn't be losers, and we have redistribution in a way where the losers in that system will just be losers, right? So efficacy, yes, but not for everyone the same way, right? So that's where this sort of ideological distinction of system difference, I think, comes in again. So I don't think one can get around that, even though one should be careful in not making it, like day and night and self-romanticize versus demonize the PRC for what it is. There's a lot of shades and gray in between, right? And part of that, why it was possible, I think, is indeed how the other leading nations how the US has behaved in its China policy, how European countries have. So it's a more complex story that I would think has contributed to the so-called rise of China, with a lot of question marks how that will continue. But I think we'll get to that later. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Dear Mr. Luxinger, what could you say about it? You do engage in meaningful discussions with a lot of various actors from both Europe, from Asia. How do they see it, and what is your personal opinion on that topic? What contributed to this rise of China?
So we said before, and Ambassador Riccatoni said this, it's always like comparing countries is tricky. Countries are big, complex beasts, and we have to be careful. Having said that, obviously I've just said this because I'm about to compare two countries. one of the data points that I still can't fully get over is in 1990, the GDP per capita of China and India was the same. I think India was even like mildly ahead, not meaningfully though. So if you look at the two trajectories of those two countries in that time, that's quite amazing. And it's not like, it's not like India has gone through like 20 years of economic crisis and stagnation, like for example Japan has. Like the Indian economy has grown not nearly as fast as it should have. Different conversation for a different evening, but it still has grown. So I think it just shows you that again, it's hard to compare these two countries, and definitely we shouldn't drill down to single cause and effects, but I do think that's instructive, and we have actually engaged in a number of conversations this year about, there is a bit of a sense in the Indian policymaking community that's, India now has a chance to basically follow the Chinese trajectory. And I do think it does, and one of the things, if you talk to Indian experts, that they point to that India would need to do to have a shot at this is to reform its education system. So from that, it follows, again, the Chinese education system is one of the many topics we're discussing tonight, about which I'm not an expert. It's kind of the story of my life. It follows that I think this is one thing that China did comparatively well. You can point to many flaws in the Chinese education system, but it did, I think, do a reasonably good job in having an education system that would allow for this kind of growth. And the other thing that I talked about for way too long before already, I'm just going to point again to the high savings rate. Now, why China has such a high savings rate is actually a very interesting debate, and it's not like totally resolved. There are different theories of why that is. But if you are a low-income country and you want to go on a growth spree, of 20 years, then having a lot of this excess capital that you can invest to build infrastructure, to kind of like develop your markets, is actually really useful. And one way to get to that is to have a high savings rate. So I think that's another fact. Again, if you compare the savings rate to China and India, it's like day and night, again, for many different reasons. And so I think those are two, obviously not all reasons for success, but it's a really interesting question. I don't think anybody has the final answer of why China has experienced the kind of success that it has. And I think we should be clear, like, this is a success story, right? Mm-hmm. All the criticism that I think are absolutely valid towards China's political system and what the CCP does all day, we should acknowledge that there have been objective policy success, and there have been quite many. And when this process started in the 80s, it was not at all clear that this would be the outcome. So I think that's just something to acknowledge.
Much, exactly, many minds. That's why we are discussing it here today. Maybe we'll get closer to truth, if there is any. And speaking of it, Mr. Regazzoni.
Yes, very shortly about that. I do agree that it has been a success. I don't want to give the impression that I am focusing exclusively on negative points. They are the most interesting, of course, but it's definitely a success. To take the images from the beginning, Pudong, it's a good thing. Shenzhen, it's a good thing. I think fight against poverty, it's a very good thing. I think it has been a larger success. Then self-correction, that's the most delicate thing, because infrastructure, it has been already said, allocation of resources, excessive allocation of resources, real estate, we haven't been talking about that, but it's a huge example of bad allocation. For which reasons? Overcapacities as well. SOEs who are producing all at loss, by the way, state-owned enterprises, but maybe their goal is not just to make profits, but to create employment, question mark. But basically a success story, or largely success story. Now, which reason? One name, Deng Xiaoping. I think that it has been the right person at the right moment to set free the potential of the country at the right moment in history, to open to the market and to allow market forces, to bring in market forces and develop the country. There are several other factors, but I would say yes. Or time to time, also great persons make great countries. And yeah, if I would have to single out one for China, is Deng Xiaoping.
Thank you very much, and making this question more sort of broad. Of course.
Sorry, I was good. Like, I had this point written down. I was going to totally sort of make it my closing statement, but I think it fits really well. I'm just going to basically get rid of it now and then have nothing to say at the end. So one thing that I think factors into the question of why China has been so successful in developing economically, I think and I think that's become much more clear over the last maybe 5 to 10 years, is that I think we have to credit China also with perhaps understanding more quickly the dawn of what is usually called like the age of geoeconomics, whereas I think the Western societies sort of got maybe slightly too high on the idea of sort of, the end of history and the neoliberal world order and sort of free markets reign everything. And I think, China was long derided for its sort of, comparatively heavy-handed economic policy, industrial policy, kind of very actively tried to shape which industry should be developed and where, right? That's why you have like entire cities in China that sort of are focused on like, producing one sort of category of goods. And I find it's very interesting because if you look what countries do, if you look, sort of the debate in Europe, Switzerland's still slightly behind the curve on this, as we usually are, but we're going to get there at some point. Like, we now also are talking about industrial policy, right? The EU wants to invest a ton of money to get battery manufacturers here. If you'd made this succession 10 years ago, you've been left out of the room because it's like the market will take care of this, and who are we to sort of, invest in this? And I think here, irony of history, kind of the communists, or maybe the former communists, kind of like got that right much earlier. I don't think it's because they necessarily saw further ahead. I think it was partially also luck, but I do think this, sort of the idea that the state actually has a strong role to play in developing specific sectors and industries and in fostering sort of technological development and innovation, I think it's something that we've actually come around to and that has been in China for way longer. And I think that's somewhat of an unpleasant acknowledgement to make because we would love for that not to be true, but I think it is. Anyway, that was my closing statement. Thank you very much for that.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, just building on that industrial policy point, I think it's super important. And if you look at what's happening last 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years in China, then I think one reason why certain industries are doing so well is because of industrial policy. Now, China has always had industrial policy. Soviet-type systems have industrial policies, 5-year plans and whatnot. And this was no different during the Deng Xiaoping period. But in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, perhaps, China was still playing catch-up, right? It's comparatively easy to produce garments, right, shoes and whatnot, right? But if you move into high-tech, if you move into higher value kind of products, your industrial policy 5-year plans just don't cut it anymore. Right? You need to develop a more elaborate kind of industrial policy. And I think this is where China has excelled quite massively. I mean, if you just look at AI, the AI, artificial intelligence tech stack, okay? And I looked this up before coming here, okay? So what you have in industrial policy with regards to AI, you've got national and local robotics programs. You have autonomous vehicle pilot zones. You have local government procurement. You have local and national research funding. You have programs such as the National Integrated Computing Power Network, national investment funds. Right? This is lodged in venture capital guidance funds at the national level. There's policy support for local open data platforms, promotion of open source models, frameworks, right? It's all policy oriented, right? You have policy, you have money, which is then further integrated in national artificial intelligence investment funds, internet investment funds, AI pilot zones, local government investment funds, industrial parks, talent incentives. If you look at the news recently, there's a new visa initiative in China, which has drawn the ire of Chinese netizens. But here in education, right, the Ministry of Education came out with a new set of undergraduate majors in April this year or March this year that also include majors on artificial intelligence, on design, on digital engineering, and these kind of things, right? Computer science, these kind of things, which is future-oriented, right? Will we see results from these initiatives? Next year? No, right? But will we see innovation when the first PhDs from these programs graduate or first master students from these programs graduate 10 years, 15 years down the line? You bet, right? And if you see now the founders of DeepSeek or these big companies, right? When were they educated? They were educated in the early 2000s, right? Which coincides with a wide-scale expansion of higher education and a focus on these kinds of future technologies, right? And then you have also startup programs. You have subsidized compute vouchers and then state-backed AI labs, right? So you have all these different tools, and this is just artificial intelligence, right? Just artificial intelligence. We're not talking about batteries. We're not talking about electric vehicles. We're not talking about renewable energy, right? You have a whole ecosystem of different tools that work together, that also compete with each other. Will there be a lot of wasted money? Yes, definitely. Does it correspond to ideas of economic efficiency? Not really, right? Does it matter? Arguably, doesn't really matter, because you might see results anyway, right? Will there be corruption? Yes, etc. But I think this is something that we, or many countries and many Western countries, it's very, very difficult for us to replicate, right? Because the state in Western countries just plays a very different role compared to the role of the state in China, right? Which is able to leverage all these sectors and change all these sectors and influence all these sectors through these different initiatives, and that we just cannot do. Does it make sense for us to do that here in Switzerland or in the West? That's a different question. But what can we learn from that? And I'm sure there are some aspects that we can actually learn from that, what we can take from that as well. Yeah.
All right, and there's some aspects that we could learn from China. What would it be? What do you think? What could we learn apart from industrial policy from them? In education, in any other sphere, what are the most crucial points that we cannot imitate but probably wisely implement, taking them as an example in that sense and probably leverage our own systems? Yes, please.
Just a word on the industrial policy, and then I answered this question. But it's also one of the few things I noted down, where I thought, yes, I understand why one can think that we can learn from industrial policy. And it is true. Almost every political actor has this discussion, right? In the European Union, in Switzerland, everywhere, industrial policy, yes or no. But it's also really important to understand what that means, right? And then I'm not quite sure whether I'm such a fan of it, right? Because it means a lot of what came with liberalism, right? Is maybe not what industrial policy is really good at maintaining, right? And to the extent that industrial policy comes with nationalist goals, right? It's China first, it's America first, it's whatever first, right? It caters into the sort of theme of deglobalization, right? And that, I think, is, if anything, it's not necessarily efficient, and it's politically maybe dangerous, right? And a lot of these efforts that the PRC has very successfully done, talent pooling, right? All of that, industrial parks, well, that goes with a lot of knowledge transfer, illicit knowledge transfer, with a lot of overlap to espionage and this and that, right? So it shows a bit the spirit in which that also can come, and that's what I'm worried about, even though I do understand the discussion about industrial policy as being really an interesting one, but one gives up quite a bit. And now to your question, the title, China, an example to follow. Right? In preparing for this, I also got a bit from colleagues pushback about the title, right? What is suggested here? And I wanted to say something on that, and maybe that answers a question a little bit. Of course, one can learn from China. No problem. I can learn from anything, for instance, by a negative example, right? No problem. And I can think of literally nothing that would not be worth studying and trying to learn something. Now, that's an abstract professor answer, I think you would say, right? Now, the fact is also, this question is not posed in an empty space. It's not a vacuum, right? So there's discourses that are about, should we follow China? What can we learn? And in this country, at least, right, the discourse can be found maybe at both ends of the political spectrum, usually. Interestingly, at both ends, right? And there's also this romanticization of strongman rule, efficiency. They can do something democracies cannot because they're too complicated, too many things, right? So I think in that discourse, the question, I think, needs a bit of problematization also, right? Because one must be very careful in not furthering that agenda by holding a public event about what can we learn from China, right? And that's why I think, yes, one can always learn, but I think we probably, 4 of us, would have different ideas about what it is and what not, right? Although I think we actually agreed much more than we should have on a panel, right? Too many questions, but maybe you wanted to get close to truth. Maybe that's what you can see there, right? But it's very difficult to pose this question, and I could give you tons of examples of what I personally have learned from China. But what do I mean by China then? Is it the nice books? Is it the tradition? Is it the clever people? Is it the personal encounters where I learned a lot from people, right? Or is it the political system, right? And when we ask efficiency, we tend to think about the political system. And there I think we should not separate it from the many discussions we have about what can we learn from China. That's a dangerous path to go down, I think.
Okay, so you think it's a dangerous path, and we should be very careful from taking something from China, learning something from them as from a government. And what do our other speakers think
Because of the goal and means distinction that I introduced at the beginning, right? If we, to the extent that you agree with the goals, be happy in learning. Right? About the means that lead you to that goals. But if you're not entirely sure about you share the goals of that regime, then we should be careful, because easily we can otherwise be duped into believing that the means should be adopted and can transfer it without the political context coming along, or with us adapting to that political context slowly but incrementally, right? Because something one could also try to learn is technocracy. And then the specter of technocracy is not just there in the People's Republic of China, it's also there in our society, in democracies everywhere, right? So that was the second area I noted down. If you would have forced me to say something that we can learn from the political system, right? I would have named industrial policy and technocracy, but I'm not so sure whether I want to learn those things. Sorry.
Okay, so to reformulate it. We have our goals, right? As a society, as our systems, whatsoever, as our government. Could our government, taking our goals, take something from the Chinese model to facilitate the achievement of these goals? Would it be possible? Mr. Luxinger, what do you think about it?
No. Would you like me to expand?
Yes, of course. Elaborate, please.
I think Professor Weber's argument I would totally agree with, but I think we don't have to go sort of to the normative level. I think the main reason why I don't think Switzerland and Swiss government can necessarily learn something. When you say learn, like the term's kind of like fuzzy, right? Because learning, as I think Professor Weber has said, can like mean many things. It can sort of, yes, we can learn in the sense like we can look at what's going on in China, we can try to understand it, and we can draw your own conclusion. What you mean is not learning. What you mean is copying, and I don't think that's going to work. And for the very simple reason. First of all, every country is unique, every country has its own history, and I think sort of copying, templatizing forms of governance and sort of trying to implement them somewhere else never really works. But then of course I say this because I think there's sort of a bit of an undercurrent sometimes in the Swiss-China discourse to kind of see the two countries kind of like on eye level, right? And sort of you'll hear the Swiss say a lot like we have a special relationship with China. And again, without going into the history of the Swiss-Chinese relationships, which Ralph Weber can tell you a lot about, I always found it to be a strange formulation for the simple reason is that they were the most populous country, they're the second most populous country now, but they used to be for a very long time, as far back in history as you want, they were the most populous country on the planet. They're an empire, an entire continent, and Switzerland is like a small place where 5 people live. So it's really sort of like the comparison is absurd. And I think I've never understood why would you, of course it doesn't work. The same way as China can learn from Switzerland in the sense that they can, sort of study the Swiss model and draw their conclusions, but they would never think of just copy pasting, and neither should we. So that's slightly longer answer. No, I don't think we can. Can I say one more thing?
No, go.
Again, was was my other sort of one backup plan for my final comments. I'm going to give this to you now. Again, afterwards, I really have nothing to say anymore. So I think the thing we need to do, and this goes far beyond China, and it goes far beyond sort of the kind of government and efficiency is, there's a term, again, not coined by me, but I really like it, called strategic empathy. So I think that's sort of the goal that we need to have. We don't need to agree with what the Chinese government does. I certainly don't. I think my co-panelists don't either. My assumption is none of you fully agree. You may agree with some things, you may disagree with other things, pretty much similar to maybe how you feel about the Swiss government and other governments. But what I do think is very important, and that's why I'm so happy that we have this conversation, is we need to find sort of what strategic empathy means is going to the work of trying to understand where it's sort of what the rationale of sort of the other actor is. Like, why are they making the decisions they're making, right? And not to presuppose either always kind of like malicious intent, but also not to presuppose always just kind of like good intent, right? Sort of I think these categories are problematic anyway. So the question is, why is the Chinese government or Chinese actors behaving in the way that they're behaving, and which historical, cultural, economic factors are driving them to do that? And you can understand that, and you can learn from it without having to go all the way and say, like, I'm actually agreeing with it or I want to copy it. That's still very important work that we don't do enough, and that I think we desperately, urgently have to do a lot more of. I'll shut up now.
Thank you very much for your input. Once again, study phonology. And
I'll respond to that later. Yes, study phonology, but also, like, if you don't want to, I have other ideas for you.
No, study phonology, please.
Asia Institute, you are welcome. Just on the other side of the road. But yeah, Mr. Regazzoni.
To answer this question about is there something to copy or not? Of course not. I think already in what I said before, every country has a different history, and especially given this maybe question about the goals. What are the goals? What is good for following the goals of the government? I think there is not. It's a wrong approach. But if the question would be, is there something I envy in the Chinese system? There is one thing I envy: is the long-term perspective. Is the long-term perspective something which is specific to an authoritarian system? Not at all. The train which brought me here from Lugano this afternoon is the result of a long-term perspective, of a vision. And I think it's probably in the present situation of our democracies, we are not able to go before. The France example is a tragic one. I think the government, the impossibility to build up a government in such an important country like France today. We are blocked, stuck in this situation, but I think that democratic systems can have, or used to have until short ago, a long-term vision, and I think there is something for different reasons. I don't want to copy-paste at all from China. They do have that, and I envy that in comparison to our present situation.
Okay, but speaking about copy-pasting, in Switzerland, or broadly in Europe, we do not want to copy-paste that system, but there are a lot of other regions, other countries that do share other perspectives. What would you say, speaking of China's foreign policy, speaking of their initiatives where they try to connect other countries through the Belt and Road Initiative to themselves, do they also spread, to some extent, their government's model or not? What do you think about it? Does the world it's been taken over by these technocratic sort of dictatorships? What do you think about it? Dear Mr. Mittelstädt, do you have something to share with us on that topic? On their government's model, do they also spread it outside the country?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure. So yes, there are some aspects that are being spread outside, but if you look at actually the China model, or the China model as a concept has come up, right? And the China model was very big in 2007, 2008, 2009, but the China model in itself, including all its political, economic values, institutions, etc., cannot be copied. It cannot be copied for obvious reasons, because they are specific to China. And if you look at documents, well, the Chinese themselves say that, well, you shouldn't copy our model, and the China model in that sense does not exist, right? Because it is very specific. It has grown out of China's specific socioeconomic, historical kind of the development path. That being said, if you look at specific sectors, and here you could look at sectors such as internet governance, you could look at censorship, you could look at paths of development, right, where China's path of development started in the rural areas with farming, etc., right? If you look at very specific sectors, then I do think they believe that a lot of, especially developing countries, can learn a lot from in these specific sectors. And you see this in a lot of different ways. One way, for example, is there's a very active military-to-military relationships in terms of teaching, in terms of bringing officers to China, educating them. There's also and a lot of universities have dedicated programs for foreign officials in communication studies, showing them how the Chinese media ecosystem works. Right? And you don't know what they learn in these courses, but if they learn what China is doing to its media, and they bring that back, well, then that's a very state-controlled kind of party state, very top-down approach to what media and what journalism is supposed to be. Right? Or if you look at rural areas, you look at farming, people come over to China to learn about farming, these kind of things. So this is... I think in this narrow aspect, yes, China believes that they have something and a lot to contribute. I think this is not just on the technical side, this is also on the normative side, where they have or enhance their influence in institutions such as the World Health Organization or the United Nations in general, or even interpretations of human rights in the Human Rights Council. But do they want to export like a China model? I don't think so. I don't see any evidence of that because the China model, I believe, and according to them, doesn't really exist in that sense. I'll leave it here.
Thank you very much, dear Mr. Luxinger. And what could you say about it by your discussion with other representatives of other Asian nations? Do some of them, of developing countries in Asia, see China as an example? Or is it also rather skeptical, the same as in Europe?
I really have, I think, nothing to add to what Chris said. And I think the key point here is that it's not about exporting the model so much as it's about sort of gaining influence, which of course is Professor Weber's area of expertise, one of the many. So I'll let him talk about that. I think that's an important point.
So, are they gaining more influence? Speaking of China, their Communist Party worldwide.
Of course they're gaining influence. You can check the map and see which country has the biggest trade relations with which country, and it is usually the People's Republic of China, right? So I think what is often in the discourse, what many people are afraid of is the idea, the specter of a sort of global hegemony, right? Will China subdue the entire world and so on? I mean, they're not stupid, right? So I think they know about conceptual overstretch and imperial overstretch and all of that, right? So I think that's usually not what I'm so worried about. I would think that they would prefer to have that sort of international environment in which the rule can continue and they maximally can flourish, which is legitimate, right? And that's where I see the influence much more taking place, right? So not an attractive model that is being passed around, but diffusing challenges to other models through all sorts of means, making democracy look like they all don't get their act together. Something of the museum and the past, right? And of course, misconstruing, for instance, the significance of Europe in every possible way, but having so many very clever ways of making sure that we all constantly quarrel with each other, right? It reinforces that image of being inefficient and getting the act not together, right? So there, at this level, you see massive efforts being paid, right? Through the propaganda department, through many, many other specialized departments with a lot of resources. That's why I was stressing the point about volume, right? It's massive what you have at your disposal to do that, much more than many other actors out there. Changing rules in a favorable way would be to say, okay, let's try to reconstruct the international system and say, sovereignty is the most important thing. The international system might have gone a bit astray with progressive notions like humanitarian intervention and this and that in the 1990s, for instance. Let's try to reduce that to the core, so it's sovereignty. And on top of that, no international organizations that really have power and can restrict that sovereignty. But you have a nice photo together, You do consultation with everyone, but consultation with everyone translates into, now let me see what I can come up with the term, an institutionalized asymmetrical bilateralism, I will call that, right? So you have a nice thing, you have Belt and Road Initiative, the forum, you're talking about that. So you do a nice photo, and it shows like, where is it done? In China, great, we're the center of the world, right? But then you negotiate bilaterally with everyone. In each of these bilateral negotiations, with very few exceptions, like we heard, 5 people in Switzerland, right? It's very clear who's the power and who's not, right? And in bilateral settings, there's not many countries who can do much about the People's Republic of China being on the other side. And that's what they want to institutionalize, I think. So multilateralism is under dear attack, right, in that sense. So it's more this sort of things I'm worried about, especially for small and middle-sized countries, which have in history dependent on multilateralism, had a voice, even against a hegemon like the United States, right? In the UN General Assembly, you could go against the United States, and sometimes you had success with that. I don't see that sort of scenario, right, playing out if these rules are changed, and they're not just changed by a People's Republic of China. Many governments are happy to follow suit because it's comfortable, because they need the economic argument. They need to show their people and their voters that they're doing something about the economy. So it's a complicated picture there. But I think like the global hegemony discourse, I think, is too much, right? It's more about trying to fashion the rules in a way that is most favorable to the PRC, to continue rule and just to flourish as much as possible for the regime there.
Yeah.
May I add a few words on this issue about exporting a governance model? I definitely do. It is not the case. The point I would like to add to all the very wise observations which have been made so far is economic influence. For the history, so despite having served 12 years in Asia, I have always had a crush on Africa because I started my career there. So in Beijing as president of the Groupe de la Francophonie, I had a special access to the African colleagues. So I was asking them, how is it to deal with Chinese as Africans? And the answer was more or less this one, it's easy to deal with them because they are not asking so many conditions as you are doing, you, the West. Fine, I think there is a part of truth because we have been asking or setting levels of conditionality which are absurd sometimes, not to Africa, to go deeply into the way of accountability is a very serious thing about fight against corruption, but then it takes time or decades to change cultural patterns, and we have been asking that as condition, immediate condition for access to credits to African countries. Fine, so they don't ask questions, but I think that's a short-lived situation because, I mean, if corruption arises just in order to recover credits which have been given, and it is already shown how tough Chinese can be in this matter, far tougher than the West has been in the past decades, so there is not much to rediscover in this point. One word maybe about Belt and Road, which is a very, I think, a propagandistic way to name existing question. In other examples, I was asking companies from one country, I cannot say which one, no? So how is it after the Belt and Road Forum? Is the access to Chinese credits easier or not? Not at all. But it is something which existed already in the past. I mean, to have a minority alliance with the state-owned enterprises, it is current. It has been current in the past 2 decades. Now, you have to call that Belt and Road, but it is something which already existed in the past. Pay attention. It's a matter of fact how important is international trade, China, how important it is as a partner. But it is not yet all the rhetorics and let me say propaganda about Belt and Road, which is a way to say this thing, but in a narrative which is entirely favorable to China. I made just an example, but I could make more examples, even in terms of, I mean, after COVID, it has been focused on a very small numbers of partners. Pakistan is one of them, very important for Belt and Road. Central Asia, of course, it is. African with all the variations I've been describing before, but it is not like all of us have believed in 2019, not long ago, 6 years ago. Oh, now that's the new pattern of international relations. Not at all. That's, sorry to say that, that's propaganda. And you have to make the difference between facts and propaganda.
Okay, that's why we're here, to make this difference and show this difference to our students. And it's great that we raise these questions. Can I jump in? Of course,
quickly.
Mr. Mittelstädt,
just
you're
very quickly.
welcome.
I agree that Belt and Road is propaganda. It's a slogan. And if you think of policymaking in China, policymaking works to some extent through slogans. So Belt and Road is policy, or is a way of policy making, because it is of its sloganistic nature, right? So it doesn't really matter that, in a sense, yeah, it packages everything, but it mobilizes as well. It is a policy-making device. Just on the other issues, but very quickly. I want to complicate this a little bit by adding that, again, China and the party state is not a monolith, and there are lots of actors in China that are private enterprises. And increasingly, we see the influence of private enterprises in developing countries, in Africa, in Southeast Asia. Do they have different incentives and do they have different missions than the party state? Yes, they want to make money oftentimes, right? They want to make money. So they do something with internet, they do something with selling mobile phones or whatever, data infrastructure, etc. Can we say that they equal the party state? No, there's a different logic at play that often clashes with the party state, right? So in terms of diffusion of the Chinese governance model, it's not like it's just the party state is doing something and everybody else is on the receiving end. It's a party state, different actors within the party state, different banks actually have different incentives and different missions, okay? So they clash. It's very complicated. And then you have the private actors as well, right? Which also clash with these others. And then the second point I want to make is we cannot neglect developing countries' agency, right? Sometimes it seems that we're just talking about China's influencing everyone and China's impacting everyone, but many of these countries, all of these countries, have agency to shape certain outcomes. And there's a whole literature on local actors shaping Belt and Road projects in Brazil, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, right? Through their own politics, through their own negotiation tactics, through their own projects, etc. So it's very important not to lose this out of sight, that countries have agency and actors in these countries have agency, and these countries have politics as well, not just China. Okay.
Thank you very much. We discussed already a lot, and just to close our discussion and proceed to Q&A, probably let's speak about future. Looking ahead, where do you see China's greatest challenges and where do you see greatest opportunities, if any? Just in a couple of words so we can proceed to Q&A. Mr. Luxinger, what do you think about it? Any challenges, any perspectives of China?
I think the greatest challenge is that China's economic model is either stopping to work or at least not working as well as it has in the past. And as we've discussed, I think, on this stage tonight, we see at least not a lot of evidence that the policymaking community is changing that. The greatest opportunity, well, maybe there's two, I mean, there's more than two, but the two to point out, one, I think the obvious one here is that it's entirely possible, I think, that Chinese technological innovation sort of is going over this cliff right now where it sort of becomes a global force, the extent of which I think would be hard for us to comprehend at this point, and I think that would change the equation. Obviously, Chinese technology is already here, in all of your phones and devices, but Chinese innovative capacity has just increased dramatically. We've heard some examples from the AI side. I think the other opportunity also for China is that we talked about China wanting to play a bigger role on the global stage, wanting to shape global governance, and I think this is just a good opportunity for them to do that because the players who have historically shaped global governance are weak. One of those countries is very actively now not so much shaping as trying to destroy global governance, and the others are just sort of constantly bickering and fighting. So if I were a Chinese policymaker, I would see this as an opportunity to really expand my influence in a big way.
Thank you very much. Mr. Weber, what do you think about challenges and perspectives of China?
Very briefly, I agree with everything Nico just has said. I just want to add maybe one point domestically, right? I think it will be interesting to see how the story continues after Xi Jinping has passed away. It certainly didn't help with the sort of innovations that he introduced to the system, right? And that will be interesting. So because a lot of this is also domestically, right? And that I think it will be interesting. I also know from a lot of friends from the PRC, right, that this was really dissented by many, that he changed the rules of like continuing, right, as a president. So, and we don't know really, I think maybe Chris knows, but we don't see the candidates there, right? So that is not good for such a system. And I always think it's taken away the dreams of an entire generation of high party functionaries who also wanted to become Secretary General and so on. So there's a lot of animosity among these circles, I'm sure, even though he seems to keep his power. And I will not join any prediction into the regime will now fall or so. Sinologists have a famous history of being completely wrong about that, and I don't want to be another data point in that, yeah.
Thank you very much for your input. Mr. Regazzoni, what do you think about challenges and perspectives of China?
About the future, I think there are mainly economic, domestic and economy-related issues which need to be sorted out. The model is not working, it's producing deflation, it's based on overcapacity, it's impossible to drive domestic consumption because you cannot do that by decree. You need consumers, and the consumers are no longer there, are the children who have not born for 40 years of one-child policy, and now it's too late to catch up. There are other concerns for the population than put up a family. The average age is 40 years old. India is 26, China is 40 nowadays. I think, is there a way to come out from this model, or China will be compelled, will keeping being compelled to flood the international markets? Now it's 37% of international manufacturing Chinese. You need somebody who is producing something else to buy. I'm not making the advocate of Donald Trump, but at a certain point in time, you need somebody who is wealthy enough to buy. And this model is flooding high-tech, is no longer cheap products, high-tech products, which cannot be consumed in China, need to be pushed out in export. That's point number one. Domestic economic model, can it be reformed or not? Open question, I don't say no. And second one is the elephant in the room, but I just spelled the name and I shut up. Taiwan. What is going to happen with the South China Sea and Taiwan? This is a major issue for the whole, not only for China, but for the whole of the world.
Can I very quickly? I just the Taiwan mention of Ambassador Regazzoni gives me the perfect opportunity to acknowledge Simona Grano, yes. Who's not just Switzerland's, but I would say certainly Europe's leading Taiwan specialist, who's sitting here. And for one of the many reasons you should study sinology at the University of Zurich is you get Chris, you get Simona, you get many other great people. So if you have any, I don't think we're going to get into Taiwan tonight, but if you have any Taiwan questions, the expert is sitting right there.
And sort of final word of this panel discussion before we proceed to Q&A. Mr. Mittelstädt, what would you say about perspectives and challenges of China in the future?
I totally agree with everything that was just said. I think Taiwan is certainly one of the biggest ones. I think the economic rebalancing, another one of the big ones. I think demographic challenges, will China turn old before it gets rich? Definitely one of the biggest ones. I think financing, local government financing to deal with the demographic crisis is a big thing. I think structurally, internationally, I think a very big challenge as well is trying to drive a wedge between the United States, Europe, and India. So as China, you don't want them to band together because China is not a normal country. China is a continent-sized country with 1.4 billion people. So it's one of the few countries in the world that, theoretically at least, could produce everything. The United States just on itself just cannot compete with that, but it can compete with that if it bands together with Europe and with India especially. So that's one of the foreign policy challenges, to not let them come together in any meaningful way.
That's going well right now.
Thank you very much. And now we are proceeding to an interactive part, and it's Q&A session. Now I would like to introduce our board members, Michel Zbinden and Julia Frey. Please come up here. They are going to moderate our Q&A session and give microphones to those of you that would like to pose questions to our esteemed panelists. So now we are ready for Q&A.